Greetings friends and welcome to the story of the world that was. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. In this episode of the history of the old world, we'll cover the story of how Nagash, the great necromancer, brought low all of his former homeland, turning the once blessed land of Nehekada into the land of the dead, haunted and ruled by ghosts of the past. We'll learn how the usurper in his hubris was toppled, just as his greatest victory was within his grasp, by an alliance of old foes, thought vanquished in the war for Cripple Peak. I hope you enjoy the retelling of these truly momentous events in the history of the old world. At the end of our last tale, Nagash, the undying king, had augmented his power greatly by forging the black armor of Nagash to hold together his warpstone-ravaged corpse, and more importantly, the crown of sorcery that allowed him to channel the winds of magic in a manner that had been impossible since his exile from Khemri and the loss of his Black Pyramid. Meanwhile, in Nehekada, Neferata, the Vampire Queen, maintained her iron grip over Lamia as her descent into madness stripped away the last of her humanity. But hidden deep amongst the desert tribes, the true king of the Blessed Land was about to make his move. Before we get started, a huge thank you to everyone for their support while life has been throwing hurdles my way. Particularly my supporters on Patreon. As a channel that focuses on the more nefarious characters, to quote a childhood icon of mine, bad times don't last, but bad guys do. If you're new here, thank you for joining us, and I hope I earn your subscription today. The year was 1222 before the coming of Sigmar, and whilst Nagash was commencing the ritual that would forge his crown, unbeknownst to him, back in Lamia, another was about to attempt a powerful ritual of their own. Washoran, the former priest of Lamia and now a member of Neferata's vampiric inner circle, had been vexed by the failure of his previous attempt to use the skull of Tutep to summon the spirit of the great necromancer. Now his preparations were much more thorough. Over the course of days he'd attuned the skull to his ritual, and many of the children of Lamia had died beneath his sacrificial blade, in readiness of the eclipse of the two moons, the silver orb of Neru, and the cursed moon his people knew as Sekhmet, the Green Witch. As the earth was bathed in Sekhmet's sickly green light, Washoran channeled the invocations he had prepared, the yellowed skull of Tutep at the center of his summoning circle once more. The ether trembled with unseen hammer blows as the mortal world faded from his eyes, and before him lay a bleak twilight plain. As his mind adjusted, he saw a vast host of shadowy figures surrounding him, and the faint sounds of the lost, begging to be released from their torment. Suddenly Washoran felt the sensation of his soul being torn from his body, and he struggled to protect himself with a second incantation. The mysterious hammer blows fell more rapidly, each bleeding into the next, and weighing strangely on Washoran's soul. Standing between realms, he perceived Washoran stumbling into his sanctum, grimacing with each ringing blow. Within the ether, the pressure was mounting. Washoran struggled as he imagined his bones warping under a terrible, unseen weight. Now a word came unbidden into his mind, as the wails of the dead grew louder, repeated with each thunderous blow. Doom. Washoran struggled to remain at the threshold between realms, as the spirits of the dead grasped for his very soul. Doom. He tried desperately to complete his summoning, first calling for Nagash to hear his summons, then commanding him to come forth as a final blow fell, discordant and terrible. Doom. A vast shape moved across the ether. The spirits grasping for him receded, wailing in misery, but Washoran was transfixed by a force of will 1,000 times more potent than his own. He soared an ancient mountain bathed in green light. A mighty fortress covered its peak. He soared upon the tallest tower, a giant, clad in armor that glowed with icy, sorcerous flames. The giant held a jagged metal crown in its grasp and turned its leering skull to the heavens. In the depths of its balefire eyes, Washoran saw the end of the world of men, before he was plunged into oblivion. When Washoran awoke, he was staring into Neferata's snarling, gore-splattered visage. She demanded to know what he had done. The other immortals of her cabal were also gathered in his sanctum, and he told them all that the reason he had failed to summon the spirit of Nagash was that the undying king still reigned in the land of mortal men. He had been rebuilding his strength far from the once blessed land, Washoran said, and now the moment of his vengeance was at hand. The necromancer said she should be prepared to grovel at the undying king's feet when he returned, and in a rage she drove a stake of wood into Washoran's heart and ordered him stuffed into a barrel and buried beneath the temple. Later that night in the city's vast necropolis, a long-dead spirit awoke. Bony hands scratched at the simple stone casket that had contained its body for decades. The silver sigils inlaid on the lid of the casket began to steam and melt, as if the will of the spirit overcame the protective bonds that sought to contain it. With a creak, the lead seals along the sides of the lid gave way, and the stone lid was hurled aside to shatter on the mausoleum floor. His master's voice had summoned him, commanding him to rise and serve once more. There was a time he would have dreaded this moment, but now he was filled only with savage joy. Pulling together the parts of his shattered bones by force of will alone, the skeletal figure arose from the casket with a green balefire guttering in the empty eye sockets of its skull. Soon the crypt's narrow door would shatter under the blows of an ancient iron sword, and Arkan the Black would stride forth into the night to answer Nagash's call. Nagash was now far too powerful for the skaven that remained around Cripple Peak to even think about challenging. Instead, they continued to trade with the great necromancer, capturing greenskins to work as slaves in his mines, and bringing him base metals plundered from other mountains in return for warpstone from his mines. Ygritte profited from overseeing the arrangement, although he mostly hoarded the wealth in order to buy his way out of exile from Skaven blight. It was after one such exchange that Lord Velesqui made a surprising return. The Grey Lord was now ancient by Skaven standards, and claimed to have come in secret. Even the council was unaware he had made the long journey back to Cripple Peak. He said the Grey Seers were troubled by portents of doom that had grown in frequency and clarity since Nagash's ritual to forge his armor and the crown of sorcery. Nagash was now far too powerful for the Skaven to fight head-on, his forces far too numerous, and his magics too potent. Instead, he brought with him a weapon more terrible than anything his race had ever created. Velesqui would leave the weapon with Ygritte. When Nagash marshaled his armies and readied his spells for the war to come, he would at last be vulnerable to an unexpected attack. Ygritte would need to be ready, and the great city would provide what aid it could. Before departing, he reminded the former warlord of one last part of Queequol's prophecy. Only one who was dead had any hope of defeating the Lich King. In 1200 before the coming of Sigmar, a twin-tailed comet was seen in the skies above Nehekara. The fearful citizens of Lamia cowered at the celestial portent, but in truth it was hard to see how much worse their lives could become. Despite Washoran's fate, some of the other immortals still plotted to gain favor with Nagash in the hope of deposing Neferata when he returned to Nehekara. Ushoran, the Lord of Masks, sought out Zuhas and offered to share power with him if he would travel out to Nagash's fortress beyond the wastes that his spies had now discovered and make an alliance with the great necromancer. The absence of the vermin like Zuhas would not be noticed by their undying queen. Alcadizzar too saw the twin-tailed comet in the sky, and knew this was the sign Ophiria had told him to watch for. He and the Bani al-Hasim waited on the outskirts of the City of Dawn to spring the ambush he had planned. The volley of arrows from his men felled both horse and riders, but one rose from beneath his dead steed and threw it aside like a child's toy. They had ambushed Zuhas and his escort. The desert tribesmen were brave and skilled, but against the might of an immortal, even one as lowly as Zuhas, they had little chance. Those that had closed in died to his claws, but the others pulled up and fired another volley that peppered Zuhas and drove him into a loping retreat back towards the city. Alcadizzar rode hurriedly after the immortal, but Fazir was swifter still and hurled a javelin that took the monster in the back, piercing its heart. Alcadizzar explained to his chieftain that this was a creation of Neferata and lopped off its head with his sword. At long last, after a century of waiting, he finally had his proof. There was one last thing he needed to do. He told his old friend his true name for the first time. Within a week, a group of Fazir's best riders were heading to Raestra. Along with the head of Zuras, they had also uncovered a number of scrolls in the possession of the ambushed riders. Scrolls that revealed that Nagash still lived, and Neferata's foul court was preparing to ally with the usurper on his return to Nehekara. They also carried a letter from Alcadizzar, urging the royal houses of all the great cities to marshal their troops and cleanse Lamia of the undying queen and her blood-drinking court. Each mobilized in accordance with a complicated schedule devised by Alcadizzar and his brother Azar, so that they all mustered on the Golden Plain at the same time. Alongside 10,000 Raestran heavy infantry and 2,000 lizard-drawn chariots, led by Prince Heru, came the war machines of the scholar warriors of Librus, with their king, Akmenefret. To their surprise, they were joined by 8,000 riders from the desert tribes, the finest light cavalry in the land, led by Fazir, who was now acclaimed as Prince Faisal, first amongst the chieftains, although the months after Alcadizzar revealed his identity had taken a toll on their friendship. The oaths they swore to each other still held true. 2 days later, 5,000 priestly warriors from Merak, known as the Devoted, arrived, and a few hours after them, the fabled tomb guard of Qatar. A further 5,000 heavy infantry wearing helms fashioned after Jizaf, the jackal-headed god of the dead, led by their king Nebunefri, lord of tombs. In a few more days, 10,000 Numasti cavalry arrived with their queen Omoros at their head, followed by 15,000 spears and 4,000 archers of Karshabar's Iron Legion, with their king, Aten Sefu, marching alongside his men. Then came the host of Zandri, 2,000 archers, 4,000 spears, and another 5,000 northern mercenaries, accompanied by their king, Rank-an Atun. In a space of a week, over 60,000 warriors from across the once blessed land had gathered. Last to arrive were the forces from Khemri, and some even doubted they would be able to muster much after the devastation of Nagash. But at dawn on the day they were due to arrive, their chariots rode into camp, singing the name of Alcadizzar, followed by 6,000 spears and another 2,000 slave auxiliaries, a meager showing by military standards, but the warriors of the living city marched with their heads held high, and followed by caravans laden with gifts and wine for their allies. Khemri would have a king once more. It would take the army 3 weeks to reach Lamia, although much depended on them securing the eastern path to the city before the Lamians could secure it. Fazir's tribesmen had taken great pains to keep the Lamians penned in their forts, intercepting every messenger and ambushing any patrol to keep them isolated. Alcadizzar was confident they outnumbered the Lamians, and they would not face the devastating firepower of the dragon men, believing none had been trained since the last war. But he warned his fellow kings that Neferata and her ilk should not be underestimated, even if their numbers were few. Alcadizzar would go through the ancient rites of Khemri. The Grand Hierophant of Petra led them to the last vizier of the living city, the regents who had ruled while he was a hostage of Neferata, and rebuilt Khemri from the ruins left by the desolation of Nagash. The joy reverberated out into the hushed crowd as he collected the ceremonial instruments of rulership, and he took his seat on the great throne of Setra. Khemri had its king. The advance of the vast army on Lamia was meticulous, securing the eastern pass without trouble, and soon the fires of the outer forts could be seen from the cursed city of the dawn. Neferata turned on her immortals in rage, with Yashoran in particular feeling her wrath. He only saved himself by guessing that Alcadizzar must be behind the great cities uniting against them. The Immortals knew that their army had little chance against the combined might of Alcadizzar's host, and Neferata reluctantly agreed to a plan that saw Yashoran brought up from the cellar in which he'd been sealed. The large earthen jar that had been his burial casket was broken, and the wooden stake that Neferata had plunged into his heart removed. The following dawn revealed the vast army that was gathered outside of Lamia's walls. But when night fell, the attack still had not begun, and the panic of the citizens rose further in anticipation. Neferata had given Yashoran access to the remaining tomes of Nagash, and he was preparing to use their forbidden knowledge in the defense of the benighted city, while her priestess thralls prepared her to face their foes directly. At her command, Anghat led their spear companies out from the southern gates. The scout pickets of the enemies were quietly dispatched, and Yashoran began the rite of summoning. Their soldiers numbered 25,000, mostly spearmen, well armed but inexperienced and fearful. Soon the sound of stone scraping against stone could be heard rising from the city's necropolis, long dead hands pushing aside mortuary slabs and forcing open long sealed doors. Bony shapes clad in rags began lurching into the night, amongst the crude stone mausoleums of the city's poor. Their numbers swelled, and before long a tide of thousands of corpses was staggering towards the unsuspecting enemy camp. Alcadizzar had expected an attack to come under the cover of night when Neferata and her immortals would be free to intervene directly. He had also suspected the possibility that the Eternal Queen may turn to the dark arts of necromancy, and he had positioned his forces in anticipation of an attack coming from the necropolis. The newly crowned king of Khemri swiftly responded to the threat of the risen dead, directing Fazir to flank the corpses and seek the sorcerer who controlled them, while ordering the Librans to move their war machines into position, just as word came of the attack of the living soldiers coming from the south. The undead horde swarmed the outer perimeter tents of the camp, seeming to have caught their foes unaware. But in truth, the Raestran infantry stationed on that flank were forming up behind barricades set behind the first 2 rows of tents. Ashuran led the advancing tide of the dead as they clambered over the barricade, as the Raestrans struggled both with their fear and the ineffectiveness of their spears against foes more bone than flesh. The Immortal was a whirlwind of death, pulping skulls and tearing through flesh with ease as he plunged into the Raestran lines. To the south, Ankat first faced the barbarian mercenaries of Xandri, who threw themselves in berserker rage against the Immortal and his spear companies. When the Lamians held, they withdrew to form a more ordered battle line, as Ankat ordered his chariots to flank their position. In his command tent, Alcadizzar received hurried reports from the fighting. The Raestrans were outnumbered by the dead, and struggling to hold their ground. The Libran war machines were yet to start firing, and the Xandrians were reporting a strong push against them from the southeast. He knew he had to reinforce his flanks, but doing so would leave the center vulnerable. With the threat of being overthrown to the left and right very real, he ordered the Numasti cavalry to counterattack in support of the Xandrians, while Kal-Shabal's Iron Legion would reinforce the Raestrans against the undead horde. The forces of Khemri and Marak would be brought from reserve to hold the center in their place. Washuran controlled his undead minions from the safety of the city gatehouse, and reveled in his success. Even the Libran war machines beginning to send fiery payloads into his host caused him no alarm. Hundreds of his corpse soldiers could perish without denting his horde, and he could see the enemy already weakening their center to reinforce their beleaguered ranks. Ushuran continued his rampage through the enemy lines, but despite the elation he felt at the slaughter of the foot soldiers, he was now hunting for their leaders. Catching sight of a fluttering pennant amongst a group of armored horsemen, he gave a guttural roar and charged. His bloodlust was to be his undoing. Before he could reach the armored party, swifter, lighter horse bore down on him from either side, their expert riders shooting arrows from powerful horse bows that pierced his flesh multiple times in seconds. The wickedly barbed heads of the arrows meant he could not pull them free, and carried a small clay vial that shattered when they struck home, covering him in sticky pitch. He realized too late the peril he was in, as 2 riders with guttering torches closed in, and he was engulfed in a furious column of flame. On the opposite flank, Ankat's push was also faltering. The barbarian mercenaries had indeed fled before his men, but now the Lamians faced well-disciplined Nehekaran infantry, well entrenched behind barricades blocking his advance. The Immortal had tried to leap the barricade twice to no avail. Now, in desperation, he grabbed the stone-laden wicker basket in the front and tossed it aside with inhuman strength. But before he could widen the breach further, sounds of alarm came from his left. The Numasti had caught his troops in the flank, scattering his chariots before plunging into his tired enemy lines. The will of his men faltered, then broke entirely, and the cavalry reaped a terrible toll on the routing Lamians. His way back to the south gate was blocked by the Numasti, and his only option was to retreat back to the city to the northeast and leave the fight to Ashurdan and his undead. Alcadizzar received the reports of the successes of the Numasti on the right, but the left was still struggling to hold the undead, and the necromancer had still not been discovered. Worse, Neferata had now joined the assault directly, committing herself to attacking the center now his strength had been drawn to the flanks. Alongside her handmaidens, she was reaping a terrible toll on the devoted of Merak, and the king of Khemri knew where she would intend to head. The seductive powers of the Eternal Queen and her priestesses was intoxicating. Men lost all sense and reason attacking their fellows in a blind rage of jealousy and passion, knowing what they were doing was wrong but powerless to stop themselves. White-robed priests blocked the hurled javelins of their allies with their bodies, faces contorted into masks of agony and disbelief. The few that could resist their enrapturing aura to press home their attacks were cut down with ease by the Immortals. Pushing forwards, 2 of Neferata's maidens fell to javelins and chariots, but by then most of the enemy were fleeing in terror. 5 women had broken the hearts and minds of thousands of warriors in a matter of minutes. Now they pushed on to find Alcadizzar. Ashurdan could see how the tides of battle were turning on each of the fronts. He was searching for an incantation that would increase the vitality of his minions, when stones from the Libran artillery began to rock the gatehouse. Rushing to gather up the tomes of Nagash, he was forced to abandon his position and his control over the dead, as huge boulders came crashing down, smashing the walls around him to rubble. In the center, Alcadizzar and Fazia rode out with the brave horsemen of desert tribes to face down Neferata and her 2 remaining handmaidens. Alcadizzar knew the enrapturing glamour of the vampires could take hold of even the most strong-willed of his men, and ordered them to stay at distance, firing a volley into Neferata's maidens as they bounded towards them with mesmerizing speed and grace. The tribesmen were expert shots, and the shrieking maidens were pierced dozens of times, falling limp as the arrows pierced their hearts. Now Neferata stood alone, facing them just beyond bowshot. Fazia urged Alcadizzar to allow his men to close in and finish her, but Alcadizzar said this was something he needed to do himself, and slid from his saddle, drew his sword, and approached the Eternal Queen. He felt her power bearing down on him, her unnatural allure pulling at his heart as he stopped mere yards from her. Neferata again offered him the chance to accept her gifts, to be her consort and rule Nehekara together for all eternity. For a moment his resolve nearly failed, such was the strength of her hypnotic glamour. But as she reached out a blood-stained hand, he remembered all the years of pain, the adoration of men who now lay as broken corpses at her feet, and the anger that welled up inside drove her urgings from his mind, and he rejected her once more. In an instant she was upon him, her swiftness and strength well beyond his expectation. Her talons raked his face and his sword was struck from his hand. A second blow to the face threatened to drive him into unconsciousness as he was sent sprawling. It took all his strength of will to fight against the blackness and then sweep her legs from under her with a vicious kick. Scrambling towards his sword, Neferata was on him again, dragging him back by the ankle painfully across the hard ground. His flailing hand closed on a fallen javelin, and twisting in her grasp, he hurled it with all his strength at Neferata, who could only partially deflect it from striking her chest as it sunk into her shoulder. While she staggered in pain and tried to pull it free, Alcadizzar scrabbled desperately for another weapon. He wrenched an axe free from a soldier's corpse, and with a swift motion he brought it down on the hand that still held his ankle. Cutting deep into her wrist, her nerveless fingers released their hold, and now it was Alcadizzar who launched a savage attack. He rained blows down on her with the axe driving her back despite her armor turning aside the worst of the impact. Again and again he struck, looking for the opening to land the fatal blow, until finally she stumbled over a body on the ground, and he saw his moment. Lunging forward, he struck her across the side of the head. The axe blade bit deep, cracking her skull from temple to jaw, and snapping her head round violently. He made to deliver the killing blow to her neck, but before he could strike, she grasped his wrist with the hand he had nearly severed mere moments before, her unnatural regeneration astounding the king. Still holding his wrist, Neferata pummeled him with blows with her free hand over and over, until he sank to the ground near senseless. She pounced on top of him, ripping at his armor until his bare throat was exposed. He barely felt her fangs sink into his skin, but as they did, he at last freed the jeweled dagger he had thrust into his belt, and with the last of his strength he plunged it deep into Neferata's side, piercing her heart. Both sides then rushed to reach the fallen pair. The desert riders reached Alcadizzar first, leaping from their saddles to drag him to safety, as others drew sabers to ensure Neferata would not rise again. Suddenly, Ankat was amongst them, striking left and right with his unnatural speed just as the few remaining Lamian royal guard joined their commander to protect their fallen queen. Just as Alcadizzar's men were about to overwhelm them, help came from an unexpected quarter, as Abarash, Lamashazar's former champion and captain of the royal guard, returned from his long exile to fall upon the rear of the king of Khemri's forces. Ordering Ankat to take the queen's body to safety, he covered their retreat on his own. Assuredon survived the flaming arrows of the necropolis, and was able to drag his ravaged body away from the city once the battle had moved on elsewhere. He'd need to find a place to shelter for the coming dawn, but slowly his body was healing. In the Lamian palace, Ankat withdrew the dagger from his queen's heart, and she returned to life. Abarash stood a short distance away, but he rebuffed her gratitude, claiming to have only come to honor his oath to protect the city from invasion and meet his final death with honor. Ankat was adamant the city was lost, and their only hope was to abandon the city now to escape the reckoning that would come for them. At first Neferata resisted his calls to flee, but the vehemence of his words swayed her. She would take a waiting ship to the east. There she would regather her strength and wait for the opportunity to enact her vengeance. Of the immortals, only Abarash would remain. Alcadizzar would recover from his ordeal enough to ride into Lamia shortly after his army had taken the city. Abarash and his guards held the gate of the palace until dawn, when the coming of the light forced the great champion inside. By the time the king's men had broken through, there was no sign of the captain of the Lamian guard or his remaining men. Neferata was also nowhere to be found, nor was there any signs of the tomes of Nagash that Alcadizzar knew must have been the source of their necromantic knowledge. Having scoured the city for 7 days and nights searching for Neferata and the tomes to no avail, Alcadizzar's men set fire to the palace and set forth into the Golden Plain with their slaves and plunder, leaving Lamia behind ruined and deserted. Alcadizzar and the other kings would meet again at the great city of the desert tribes, where he also met Khalida, named in honor of the legendary warrior queen of Librus. The political maneuvering soon began in earnest, each kingdom eager to claim the lion's share of Lamia's riches. In the end, the gold was split nearly equally 7 ways, with the desert tribes receiving a slightly larger portion for forfeiting the slaves their laws would not allow them to take. The following day they each took their leave, carrying the riches back to their kingdoms, and bound by new political ties to the throne of Khemri. A new era was dawning. Just before he departed for Khemri, he was visited by Opheria, followed by her hooded servant, the Chosen of Khazar. She revealed that Khalida was her niece, and was pleased he had shown an interest in her, but she had come to warn him of the coming of Nagash. It would be maybe years or decades before the usurper would come, but his vengeance was inevitable, and Alcadizzar needed to use his time wisely. Nehekara would need to be prepared. Wushuran had made his way north and west, sheltering in caves and crevices from the light of day and feeding when he could. He crossed the wastelands drawn to the fell energies he felt through the ether, towards the great fortress of Nagash. At the shores of the great sea, he was beset first by twisting, scaly creatures that lurked in the marshes, and then by pale-skinned monstrosities that stalked him through the hillsides, until he finally turned and fought them off with his terrible claws and blasts of dark magic. He passed through the territory of the flesh-eaters until he finally reached a wide road of black stone that led to the first of Nagashazar's mighty walls. As he approached, the gates opened and he was met by a dozen wights wreathed in icy mist and flickering green grave light. They were led by a Lich wearing ragged robes, whose eyes seemed to flare with hateful recognition at the sight of Wushuran. But undaunted, he presented himself and said he bore gifts and news for their master. Eventually he found himself brought to the throne of the undying king in his great antechamber. Falling to his knees, Wushuran offered the tomes he had carried back from Lamia, returned at last to the hand that wrote them. Washordan told Nagash of the fall of Lamia and the rise of Alcadizzar to the throne of Khemri. Raising slightly from his own throne, the immense will of Nagash smashed Washordan to the floor as he demanded to know more of the usurper who claimed to have the blood of Setra in his veins. The year is now 1163 before Sigmar, and in Khemri, Alcadizzar had ruled for 37 years. At first, the horror of Lamia and the threat of Nagash had drawn the great cities together in peace. Alcadizzar ensured that as Khemri's fortunes rose, so did those in the rest of Nehekara. An alliance became a confederation, and then an empire. But the memories of Lamia faded in time, and the threat of Nagash seemed also to recede from the minds of the rich and powerful in the great cities. Some even doubted the undying king still lived at all, and chafed against their military obligations to defend against a threat that never seemed to come. There had been a recent war with Zandri, as the expansion of the empire northwards had meant there were other, more efficient routes for the slave trade than through the coastal city. When Alcadizzar gained victory, he found the king had fled the city, leaving its coffers empty and its people on the verge of starvation. It was left to the king of Khemri to restore order and help rebuild the lives of its poor citizens. Nehekara's northern border now extended for hundreds of leagues past the former extent of their territory, near Numas, and now trade routes extended beyond the World's Edge Mountains. They had even made contact with the Karaz-Ankur, and assurances of trade and friendship had been made between the two peoples, with High King Morgrim Blackbeard sending Alcadizzar the gift of a magnificent two-handed sword, said to be an anathema to evil, and a suit of armor of exquisite craftsmanship. Knowledge of the arcane had been growing in Khemri, and Alcadizzar had founded a collegium of magic within the first decade of his reign. Still bereft of the gifts of their gods, the king knew they must seek other means to combat the foul sorcerers of Nagash. The forges of Karshabar now made small amounts of enchanted arms and armor each year, and Alcadizzar hoped the dwarfs would pass on some of their knowledge to further that aim. Soon word came to Alcadizzar that Opheria had arrived, accompanied by a host of desert tribesmen seeking an immediate audience. Her warning was dire. Nagash was coming. Nagash had spent the last few decades continuing to build his armies and training both Washordan and Arkan further in the dark arts of necromancy. Arkan would take overall command of the Undying King's host, while Washordan and the few barbarians he had selected to become his own immortals would serve as Arkan's lieutenants and command individual legions in the vast army as the Lich deemed fit. Nagash had one final task to complete. He held Washordan's head as with his armored thumb he carved a glowing green sigil into the flesh of his face. "Go forth," intoned the Undying King, "into the lands of men, where the name of Nagash has been forgotten. Go you to the great cities and cast them down." Nagash continued, weaving the incantation that would bind Washordan to his legions. "Cast down the palaces of the proud kings. Cast down the temples of the fallen gods. Fill every well with dust and every road with ash. Let the winds carry the lamentations of the people to the far corners of the world. Nagash drew his hand away. The sigil of binding pulsed fitfully against Washoran's grey skin. In the name of Nagash the Undying, go forth, faithful servant, and conquer. As he looked out over the huge bone ships that would carry his army across the sea to Nehekada, the Undying King raised a smoking fist to the heavens. Now, let the end of the living world begin. The warning given by Opheria spread quickly to every corner of Khemri, relayed by the Collegium of Sorcery to each of the great cities. Within hours, horns were sounding across the Empire, calling the fighting men to war. Over the years, Alcadizzar and his war council had devised and refined a grand strategy, with each of the city's armies having a defined role to play. Alcadizzar now oversaw the assembling and coordination of the armies, and within weeks the forces of Rystra and Karshabar were on the march north towards their assigned positions, as the Khemrians mustered and prepared to board ships. A few weeks later, Zandri and Numas were also on the march. Only the holy city of Merak appeared to have reservations about the king's grand strategy, but for now Alcadizzar could only plan and hope. The undead fleet took 2 weeks to cross the narrow straits and reach the ruins of Lamia. The cursed city was now home only to squatters and desperate bandits, and soon their screams filled the night as the undead swept into the city. Washoran and Arcan had an uneasy alliance, and the Lamian plotted the Lich's demise now they were away from their master's unblinking gaze. If the opportunity presented itself, he would ensure Arcan fell, if not by his hand, then by the enemy's. Arcan would not enter the city, and with the passing of a few days, Washoran sent one of his immortals to find the Lich, only to discover he had headed west with his troops almost as soon as they'd made landfall. Furious, the necromancer drove his troops in the same direction, determined the Lich would not get the honor of taking Khemri and capturing its king alone. When he caught up to them some 3 weeks later, Arcan was drawing his troops into fighting order. A Nehekadan army of Rystra and Librus was blocking the trade road that led to the City of Scholars. Arcan and Washoran argued at the cause of the rapid deployment of such a force to meet their advance, and a careless boast from the necromancer caused Arcan to withdraw his troops and allow Washoran to engage the combined army with his forces alone. The enemy numbered between 80 and 100,000 fighting men, with at least 40 catapults, but the legions Washoran commanded still outnumbered them greatly. His skeleton archers advanced into firing range and unleashed a volley, and while some found their mark, they were mostly blocked by upraised shields and the armor of the Nehekadans. The enemy bowmen responded, and as their arrows struck home, there was a tiny flash of white, and the skeleton archers collapsed instantly. Washoran realized there must be magic involved. The catapults and arrows destroyed his lead companies of spearmen, but Washoran and his immortals unleashed incantations to bolster the vigor of the ranks behind, and they surged forward until the silent mass crashed into the lines of Rystran heavy infantry. They too had wards of protection on their shields, and symbols upon their weapons that crumpled the skeletons with every strike. Still, the undead horde was immense, and on the flank unliving chariots and cavalry supported by their remaining archers were driving off their Nehekaran counterparts and encircling to strike at the Libran catapults at the rear of the army. After nearly an hour of fighting, besieged on all sides, trumpets along the battle lines sounded, and the Raystrans began a steady but disciplined retreat. Sensing victory, Washoran cast more incantations to urge his skeletons forward. But now they were dispelled, and a sudden surge of magical energy saw the ground in front of his warriors erupting into a howling wall of dust and sand. When the sandstorm finally cleared, it revealed the Nehekaran army had pulled back at surprising speed, even the catapult teams, and their remaining cavalry were screening from further pursuit. Washoran would be forced to follow them to Libras and possibly beyond, giving the other cities time to marshal their forces. Tensions between Arcan and Washoran continued to rise as the Lich questioned the spirits of the Raystran dead, to discover they had been preparing for the coming of Nagash for decades. Their enchanted weapons and armor further proof that numbers alone would not defeat them. They agreed to split their force, sending 4 of Washoran's immortals with a third of their troops to occupy Raystra and Libras, while they took the rest of their army west to strike for Khemri. News of the first battle reached Khemri as Alcadizzar and Khalida prepared to board the barges moored at the city docks to carry the Khemrian army along with the horsemen from Numas and the desert tribes. He had hoped the Eastern army would delay the undead for weeks, but now his thoughts turned to Qatar and the hope that they could hold the Gates of Dawn. The undead host first fell upon Merak, the seat of the Hierarchic Council, where its defenders had refused Alcadizzar's urges to withdraw from the once holy city. Arcan surrounded the city and probed their defenses with minor attacks over the next 24 hours, before starting the siege just after sunset the following day. Once it began, the assault was relentless. The defenders valiantly tried to hold the walls against the swarming undead host with its animated bone constructs. Necromantic energies lashed the battlements, blasting apart the living and reanimating those who had fallen. By dawn, the city walls had fallen, and by nightfall the inner gates had fallen too. By then, there were no defenders left alive to try to reclaim them. Over the next 3 days and nights, every living thing within Merak's walls was slaughtered. The temples were put to the torch, and the corpses of the slain raised up to join the ranks of the conquering army. Arcan drove his troops to the Gates of Dusk at the eastern end of the Valley of Kings, only to find the formidable stone bulwark deserted. Believing the garrison must have joined the doomed defense of Merak, he pushed on and entered the valley. Unbeknownst to the Lich Lord, Alcadizzar's fleet had made the journey up the Golden River, a tributary of the Vitae that wound through the bitter peaks. Using a series of stone docks built there by the king of Khemri in secret for this very moment, his army was about to pass through a narrow road, carved through the mountains that would lead them to the Gates of Dusk, trapping Arcan's forces between themselves and the forces of Qatar and Kar-Shabar that already held the Gates of Dawn to the west. Sped by dark incantations and under a shroud of perpetual night, the undead host crossed the Valley of Kings in a mere 7 days, but was spread over 10 miles by the time their vanguard reached the heavily fortified Gates of Dawn. A killing ground had been cleared 100 yards in front of the first line of defenses, and as Arcan's cavalry vanguard raced to close to the first wall, catapults rained fiery payloads upon them as the archers manning the 20-foot-high walls unleashed volley after volley. The Lich had no option but to withdraw and await the arrival of the slower contingent of his army. It took 10 days for Alcadizzar's western army to reach the Gates of Dusk. Word came that Libris was under siege, but holding in the hope reinforcements from Raestra would arrive in time. He also learned that Arcan had reached the other end of the valley, his host at least 100,000 strong. He sent word ahead to the Gates of Dawn, saying he needed the Qatari forces to hold for 10 days. The first wall held for 2, against the near-constant attacks of the Horde. The second wall was higher, and too thick to be breached by artillery. After a fruitless 5 days, Arcan ordered Washoran to send in his Immortals, a risky strategy, considering they needed their powers to control a substantial portion of their army. The gamble paid off, as the Immortals were able to scale the walls under the cover of a magical fog and take the gatehouse from within, opening the great gates to allow the undead horde to breach the defenses. Now the surviving defenders were forced to fall back to the third and final wall, a massive bastion of basalt some 60 feet high, with a mighty gate 2 foot thick, made of slabs of the same volcanic rock. Arcan's forces threw themselves at the defenders for a week before they withdrew, and a lull of 2 days followed. The defenders began to hope they had prevailed, when a faint tremor began to be felt through the stones beneath their feet. Arcan, aided by Washoran and his Immortals, had constructed 6 massive bone giants. They carried a 15-foot-long battering ram made from a sandstone column between them, and began advancing to the gate. To cover their march, the necromancers enacted a ritual that sent thousands of tomb beetles pouring over the battlements to attack the defenders. Alcadizzar's army was now only a quarter mile from the Gates of Dawn, and could hear the hammering of the great battering ram as the undead attempted to break through. He ordered his wizards to conceal their approach, and instructed his various contingents in their roles in the battle ahead. Most importantly, they were to seek out the necromancers that controlled the army. If they could be slain quickly, victory would be assured. The gates were finally cracking under the thunderous blows of the battering ram. With the defenders still beset by his swarms of scarabs, Arcan ordered the slow advance of his cavalry and made ready to pour through the gates once they failed. The Western army retook the first wall undetected, their archers moving swiftly into position as the cavalry and chariots led the infantry through the ruined gates and into the tunnel beyond. There would be no time for formations once they emerged. All that was left to do was charge. The ritual controlling the swarm of scarabs was complex and taxing. Distracted, Washoran and the Immortals did not detect the attack from behind until the arrows started to rain down on their lines. Forced to duck for cover, the ritual came undone, and Washoran turned to see tens of thousands of men bearing down on them. At their head, a man in golden armor held aloft a fiery sword. The sight of Alcadizzar made his black heart turn cold. At the front, the first signs reached Arcan that something was amiss. The screams above stopped, as did the ceaseless buzzing of the scarabs, and then he heard the wailing of war horns and the rending crash of cavalry striking home, and he knew the rear of his forces were under attack. The charge of Alcadizzar would have broken a mortal army, but the dead simply turned and silently fought back, despite their grievous losses. Eventually the tide would turn against him, unless he found the necromancers. Spotting Washoran's bone palanquin, Khalida turned Alcadizzar's chariot, with their royal guard following. They bore down on skeleton spears that blocked their path to the necromancers. His archers poured fire into the companies in support of their king, before the chariots crashed home. It looked as though they would break the line when suddenly a blast of heat and green light struck them. When Alcadizzar awoke, he was being dragged back from the wreckage of his chariot. His sword lay beside the overturned vehicle, and worse, he saw a slender, bloodied arm poking out beneath its hull. Screaming Khalida's name, Alcadizzar fought against his would-be rescuers, determined to reach the hand of his beloved queen. Scrambling on all fours, he'd nearly reached her when he was attacked by a shriveled, almost skeletal man, clad in rough barbaric robes and bits of bronze armor. The fangs in the creature's maw told Alcadizzar what he faced. Alcadizzar retrieved his sword, and as the immortal lunged towards him, he struck a blow across its midriff that parted armor, cloth, and flesh as easily as paper. The power of the sword shriveled the monster instantly. Another immortal bore down on the king's wizard, Suleiman, and the two exchanged spell and counterspell, neither getting an upper hand. Then one of the king's chariot archers loosed an arrow that struck the abomination in the forehead, before Alcadizzar severed its neck. Cheers rose from the Nehekaran soldiers as the foul magics controlling sections of the undead horde were broken, and they collapsed back into piles of bone. Their joy was short-lived as the king's chariot was pitched through the air by an unseen hand, and two more emaciated blood drinkers, one wearing remnants of Nehekaran robes, were revealed in a ritual circle where 3 small earthenware jars were placed. Suleiman tried to protect his king, but the Nehekaran laughed and struck him down dismissively with a bolt of energy from his hand. The other immortal leapt for Alcadizzar, but again his brave chariot archer intervened, although this time the boy paid for it with his life. The Khemrian king avenged him immediately, plunging his sword into the face of the monster. The next thing Alcadizzar knew, he was sprawled on his back with smoke curling from his breastplate. The enchanted armor had saved his life, but he still couldn't rise, as Washuran stalked menacingly towards him. Before he could reach the prone king, the necromancer let out a choked scream and reeled backwards, with one of Khalida's arrows protruding from its eye socket. His queen lived. Washuran stumbled back, and grabbing one of the earthen jars, he smashed it to the ground, releasing a swarm of beetles that engulfed his body, before rising up in a buzzing cloud, leaving no trace of the necromancer. Over the following years, Nagash's forces were driven from Nehekara, as Alcadizzar and Khalida recovered from the injuries they sustained at the Battle of the Gates of Dawn. Libris had managed to hold long enough for reinforcements from Raestra to arrive just in time to lift the siege. Eventually, Arkan was forced back to Lamia to take the last remnants of Nagash's vast host back to sea to escape the combined armies of the Khemrian king. Finally taking some rest at the former city of Dawn, Alcadizzar was visited by Opheria for the last time. He told her of his plan to repurpose the ship that Arkan had left behind and launch an attack on Nagash's fortress. The daughter of Sands was torn with what she should reveal to him, but asked him to send Khalida back to Khemri before he departed. She told him that although he would triumph if he faced the necromancer, he would never return to Khemri. Alcadizzar felt the weight of all his 180 years bear down on him in that moment. All he had sacrificed during a life spent in service to his people, now to never enjoy the peace he had earned. Never to keep the promise he'd made to Khalida to give her himself when this was done. It nearly broke his spirit, and the old seer shed a tear for his pain. When he returned to his queen, he told her to prepare to travel back to Khemri, but they would go together. he would pursue Nagash no further, and this would prove to be a grave mistake for Nehekara. When Arkan returned to Nagash, having salvaged 50,000 warriors from the vast host that had marched on Nehekara, Nagash was enraged. His fury thundered over the mountain for 7 days and 7 nights, before a terrible brooding silence descended over Cripple Peak. A month later, Arkan was sent to meet the Skaven and tasked Ykrit to take a large number of chests, each engraved with complex patterns of runes and sigils, to the source of the river Vitae and empty their contents into it. If they did this task, Nagash would double their payment in warpstone. It took the Skaven over a year to find the Tarn, but eventually they succeeded, and by 1155, before the coming of Sigmar, 9 expeditions had reached the source of the life-giving river and emptied the foul contents of their cargo into the dark waters of the mountain lake. The boxes contained shield-sized discs of warpstone carved with hundreds of arcane symbols that radiated pure magical power. By the completion of the last expedition, the surface of the Tarn was as red as freshly spilled blood. For years, Nagash's poison had spread through the great river that gave all life to Nehekara. It irrigated their fields, watered their livestock, and quenched the thirst of its people. By the time the final discs were falling into its far-off source, every man, woman, and child, every living animal and plant was suffused with Nagash's poison. With the final act completed, the river Vitae turned crimson, and within days the crops began to wither and die. Then the animals too. A horrible, slow death that drove the creatures mad with agony. Not long after, the people began to suffer the same fate. The river cities, including Khemri, were hit the hardest, and Alcadizzar used every resource available to him to try to find the source of the scourge and a cure for the plague it caused, but to no avail. As the crops failed, starvation took hold, and riots over food began to break out in all the great cities. Alcadizzar used his skills and power to try to maintain order, and succeeded for a brief period, but then his youngest son, Ubaid, fell ill, and a month later, having suffered terrible pain and begged for his death, he died, with his father at his bedside throughout. He sent his heir Asar to the desert tribes in the hope he would be safe with them. In the great deserts they came across an oasis known only to the tribes, but its waters were as deadly as any in the land, and he too fell sick, eventually wandering into the sands alone, never to be seen again. The death of both his sons devastated the king, but all he could do was watch as over the next 2 years his once noble people descended into desperate savages who would murder each other without thought for a crust of bread. Even the palace was looted when Alcadizzar opened up the remaining stores of food to his people. He and Khalida were forced to barricade themselves in the king's apartments until the mob had taken what they could. Then Khalida too fell ill. She fought against the foul plague for months, until eventually Alcadizzar gave her undiluted milk of the poppy to ease her into the next life and end her suffering. He had her entombed in the modest crypt he had constructed for them, carrying her body there himself. For a time, Alcadizzar contemplated taking the poisoned cup himself and joining his family in the afterlife. But then an exhausted messenger rode into the city, half dead from plague himself. The message was from King Heru in Raestra. An army of the dead had emerged from Lamia once more. Librus had fallen, and Raestra would be next. Knowing by then Heru would also be long dead, Alcadizzar brought forth his armor and golden sword, and turned his eyes to the east to await the coming of darkness. By 1155 before Sigmar, Alcadizzar rode out of the city as roiling purple clouds stretched from horizon to horizon. The last sons of Khemri stood before him, barely 1,000 men, weakened by plague and hunger, but determined to give their lives in the hope their sacrifice would give the last of the refugees to leave the city some chance of survival. Before them he gave one last speech. "Woe to us who have lived to see this day," he said. "Our strength is spent and our hearts are broken. Nehekara is no more. We go now into the dusk, where our ancestors await," Alcadizzar said. "Let it be written in the Book of Ages that when the world ended and darkness swallowed the land, the men of Khemri did not falter. No, they went into the night with spears in their hands, fighting to the last." The wind rose and a wall of shadow fell on his pitiful host, and with one last battle cry for the doom of his people, he flung himself into the advancing undead as arrows struck all around. He plunged deeper and deeper into the horde, his fiery sword cutting swathes through the dead. He awaited the inevitable blow that would find its mark and bring him down, then realized that none of the skeletons were fighting back. Alcadizzar screamed for them to end his life, when before him a tall, skeletal figure in bronze armor loomed out of the darkness. Arcan had come to claim his master's prize. Cold radiated from the body of the Lich, sapping what little energy the great king of Khemri still had. Undaunted, he threw himself at Arcan in his weakened state. His blows were easily parried, and he stumbled as the Lich grasped him by the throat. Alcadizzar snarled defiance, but Arcan would not end his life. Nagash wanted him alive to suffer. Soon he was stripped of his armor, his sword cast into the sands and shackled in chains of bronze. He was encased in a bone palanquin and carried back through the devastation of his empire, all the way back to the cursed city he had escaped all those years ago, and then onto a ship bound for Nagashazar. Once there, he was taken deep into the mountain fortress before being dragged from his prison and falling to his knees onto the stone-cold floor. Metal ground on metal as the undying king rose from his throne and descended the steps of the dais. Seizing Alcadizzar by the throat, he lifted him easily from the floor, mocking the once proud king in his pathetic state before tossing him aside. Nagash's eyes burned with malice as he savored his victory over his hated foe. He taunted Alcadizzar, claiming any victory he held over the great necromancer was only because he willed it. Even his survival from the plague Nagash unleashed to ravage his empire was part of his design. Now the undying king said Alcadizzar would deliver what remained of his dead lands onto him, and with that started to carve the first ritual symbol into his flesh. On the night of the next full moon, Nagash ascended the tallest tower of his fortress, with his prisoner being dragged by two wights. Alcadizzar's body was a raw, open wound, hundreds of arcane symbols carved from his forehead to his feet at the necromancer's hand. In the center of a complex ritual circle laid out in silver, Nagash first placed a great orb of pure warpstone, and then had his captive lowered to his knees at the edge of the circle, where two major lines of the sigil met. The undying king said Alcadizzar was the key to raise all the dead of Nehekara, not just those who had died of his plague or at the hands of his armies. All Nehekarans that slept in their tombs for millennia, even great Setra himself, would rise to serve him. He plunged a long silver needle into the juncture of Alcadizzar's torso and neck, and then drove another into the other side, leaving him paralyzed. Nagash's plan was not just to reanimate the bones. He intended to summon back their spirits and bind them to their remains as he had done with Arcan. To achieve such a feat, he needed a symbol to which all Nehekarans had sworn fealty. He needed the ruler of all the Blessed Land. He needed Alcadizzar. Weeks passed, and the skaven below the mountain were growing increasingly worried. The magical storms that swirled around the great peak were growing worse, and the necromancer was dragging greenskins from the mines to sacrifice every hour. Ekrit and Eshrigar debated whether the time was right to open Velsqui's casket, but the former warlord decided they would wait until the ritual was complete, hoping the toll would leave Nagash weakened and vulnerable. The incantation was the longest and most complex Nagash had ever attempted. The maelstrom he was creating was spreading far from the mountain, and now covered most of Nehekara. It would be the means by which his summons would reach across the dead land. Nagash could feel the spirits of the dead being drawn by the bond of fealty they owed Alcadizzar. The incantation burned energy at a fearsome rate. The death energies of the greenskins and the vast quantities of warpstone he'd used only just sustaining its terrible power. Now his reserves were nearly exhausted, but the ritual was almost complete. With the final words of power, the veil between the mortal realm and that of the dead grew thin, and as Sekhmet rose in the night sky, Nagash poured the last of his power into the storm as he shouted the closing phrases of his incantation. Let the veil of ages fall away. Let the dark lands give up the lost. Let the dust fall from the eyes of the kings and of the heroes and of the queens sealed within their tombs. Let the people cross the threshold of night and return to the lands of the living. Let them rise from their beds of stone. Rise, I command it. Rise and serve your master Nagash. The undying king commands it. Rise. The cyclone broke free from the tower and recoiled violently into the sky. Across all Nehekara, the dead began to stir. The newly slain victims of the plague joined the warriors slain in Arcan's campaigns. In every necropolis, dead hands beat on stone lids and mausoleum doors. In the great pyramids, ancient kings and their retinues awoke from centuries of rest. They rode from their crypts on golden chariots drawn by skeletal horses at the heads of armies of warriors who had pledged to serve their masters in the afterlife. As one, the vast tide of undead began to turn towards the east. The dead filled the night air with tormented howls as they struggled against the unseen chains that bound them to Nagash's will, but they had no choice but to obey. The greatest army the world had ever seen began to converge on Nagashazar. The ritual had drained Nagash. His armor smoked from the vast energies he had channeled, but he could feel the risen spirits of Nehekara answering his summons. He regarded the crumpled form of Alcadizzar with contempt, but as he reached to remove the silver needles, he realized that somehow the king still lived. He thought about draining the last of his life force right there, but instead he decided to allow the last living Nehekaran to continue to suffer, and ordered his whites to take him to a dungeon cell, while the great necromancer returned to his throne room to regain his strength and await the arrival of his new subjects. With the completion of the great ritual, the skaven knew this was their only chance. However, their natural instincts told them that any weapon that could kill Nagash would probably not do the health of its bearers much good either. As was the way of the rat men, when risk was involved, they needed someone else to do the dirty work. In the darkness, Alcadizzar waited to die. His mind was fractured with guilt, grief, and the pain of his ordeal. He saw an apparition of Khalidad and dragged himself towards it as it retreated from his touch towards the door of his cell. Suddenly there was a grating of the lock and two small, furtive creatures entered, dragging a heavy chest between them. They were like rodents, but of unusual size, and walking like men. The strange figures opened the chest, and the cell was bathed in a terrible greenish-black light. The foul glow emanated from a weapon, a crude, curved, single-edged sword made of a greenish-grey metal the likes of which Alcadizzar had never seen. Along its length were etched strange runes. The sword radiated death. He knew in an instant this was a weapon that could slay a god. Alcadizzar looked towards the shade of his beloved queen, and felt her wordlessly urging him to take up the sword and earn a measure of redemption. On grasping the weapon, he felt a prickly heat flood his limbs, causing pain but also giving strength to his ruined body. Silently, the apparition passed through the open doorway, and the king of lost Khemri followed with the two skaven close behind. Nagash was in a near trance-like state as he rested upon his throne. The flames that wreathed his exposed skull were all but extinguished, and the flame in his eyes were mere glimmers in hollow sockets. His dreams of conquest were broken first by the spirit of Nephirim, and then as she vanished by the onrushing figure of Alcadizzar, as the last king of Khemri charged up the stone steps of the dais and swung a glowing sword at Nagash's skull. The undying king managed to raise his arm to ward off the blow, but instead of being turned aside by his potent black armor, the blade cleaved straight through metal and bone, and in a flash of green light severed the hand. The fell blade's power leached at his bones, but Nagash was not without some power, and as Alcadizzar made to strike again, he spat potent words that sent jagged arcs of fire washing over his assailant. Yet Alcadizzar did not burn in their fury. The runes on the sword flared into life, protecting the king as he struck again, this time catching the undying one below the ribs and severing his spine. Gripped by terror he had not felt in centuries, Nagash lunged with his remaining hand and tried to throttle Alcadizzar, but the great king of Khemri used the last of his strength to raise the sword once more and brought it down on the arm, severing it at the elbow, and then with the backhand stroke, cleaving Nagash's head from his shoulders. The great necromancer's death sent shockwaves through the ether. The power of his great ritual shattered, and thousands of the corpses he had commanded collapsed lifeless once more. However, for those who had been buried with the customary rituals of the mortuary cult, their spirits did not return to the realm of the dead. Freed from the chains of Nagash's will, the great kings of old were now free to act as they pleased. Rulers from across the centuries looked out over legions of the dead, who bowed before their masters in death as they did in life. The tomb kings of Nehekara would rule the deserts from that day forward. Alcadizzar hacked the corpse of Nagash to pieces, until his body was all but consumed by the corrupting energy of the skaven blade. He allowed the sword to tumble from his grasp and ripped the crown of sorcery from Nagash's severed head, determined to show Khalida he had triumphed over the undying king. For days, Alcadizzar searched the halls of Nagash, calling out for his lost queen, his mind and body broken by all he had suffered. Eventually he stumbled out of the gates of the fortress, the crown still clutched in his hand, and disappeared into the wastelands never to be seen again. Once he had gone, Ykrit and his master of treacheries retrieved the deadly sword and placed it back in its lead casket. They then gathered up all the parts of Nagash they could find, every bone and scrap of armor, and using warpstone they stoked the largest furnace they could find and tossed every part of his remains into it. The only part they couldn't find was his severed right hand. Above Cripple Peak, a plume of smoke rose into the air from a single chimney. Ash from the fire below drifted on the breeze, some traveling miles before settling on the blighted ground around the mountain. One moat rode the currents westward, caught apparently by updrafts to travel far beyond the others, over the brittle peaks, and then in a strangely straight path over the blood-red swathe of what was the Vitae River. Far over Nehekara it drifted, until it came to the necropolis beside the river, just east of Khemri. There a brooding black pyramid towered above the lesser tombs, and the moat of ash was drawn mysteriously down through tiny air shafts in the matte black surface towards the very heart of the giant crypt. There it finally ended its long journey, as it settled within the open sarcophagus of black stone that lay at the heart of the chamber, the sarcophagus of Nagash, the undying king. I hope you've enjoyed our journey together, and I've earned your subscription today, and I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.